Hello, my name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow. I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision of a future in which humans and other animals live as one community in peace and wellness. Given all that's unfolded in the past year, these conversations are more important than ever, for they are more than mere conversations. They are opportunities for building community, salve for the isolating wounds of our time. Through Living One, together we attempt to answer the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome Vaughan Wilkins, PhD, an ecopsychologist, applied animal behaviorist, and cultural traumatologist. A skilled and inventive educator, Wilkins has spent the last decade working with captive and companion animals, families, schools, and organizations to incorporate trauma-responsive learning. His research focuses on the impacts of the loss of ecological participation across species lines in both humans and non-human animals, specifically how physical and psychological captivity impact health and wellness at both the personal and planetary levels. From the zoochosis of animals held in captivity to the collective trauma of modern technological industry, Wilkins suggests that coming home to our senses may hold the key to unlocking the cage of our shared captivity. This is the first step to once again become mutually beneficent members of the Earth community. He currently serves as a department chair at Summit Public Schools and also works directly with parents, educators, trauma specialists, and men's groups looking to build resilience during uncertain times. Wilkins holds an MA degree in the psychology of animal behavior from Hunter College and a PhD in psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. So welcome, thank you for being here, Vaughan. And interviewing Vaughan today will be Dr. Gay Bradshaw.
Hi, hello everyone. Wonderful to have you here again. Hi, Deanna. And Gretchen, I feel like Miss Nancy in that program that probably no one remembers unless they're my age. Anyways, Vaughan, it's terrific to have you here. Typically, we open the interview/discussion with me asking the interviewee describe the arc that brought you here, to where you are right now. But I'm not going to do that today. we might do it in reverse. What I'm going to say is, that the topic of your dissertation, and congratulations, Dr. Wilkins.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful feat to have that under your belt. Start off with the focus and the thesis of your dissertation, which is enculturated captivity. I believe that would encapsulate it.
Yeah.
What is that? And talk about really how you came to it.
Sure. So the quick kind of elevator pitch on enculturated captivity is there's a collective developmental low-grade trauma that just kind of hangs out over techno-industrial society that's impacting all of us. And it's actually one of the things that's most in the way of us living as mutually enhancing members of the Earth community. And where I connect that to where the human animal and the non-human animal interact is that there's an analogous illness disorder context that exists within zoo animals. So when we look across the two of them, we're looking at this loss of ecological participation. What happens when beings are taken out of that sensory participation with the living world, and what goes wrong? And today, what's right is how do we bring that back?
So describe what this sort of malaise, traumatic cloud that you describe, just describe what the evidence for that is, or what that really, what the symptoms are of that evidence.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah. So ecopsychology, that's kind of the world that I participate in most singularly, has been searching for this cultural madness or this modern malaise. What's the issue for the last 30 years? We've had all these different diagnoses and just trying to point to why is the way we're living leading towards mass species extinction? Why is the way we're living moving towards a climate crisis and climate change? So I think that the symptoms kind of exist at a ecological level, like what is the actual impact we're having on the world? And then also, what is the impact on people? So ecopsychology has identified perceptual issues, consumption and addictive issues, kind of a placelessness. The way that I locate it most succinctly is on an inability to fully engage sensorially and a loss of an ability to take direct action in the here and now. So it kind of occurs as a larger kind of step up, a fractal of what a developmental trauma or a complex post-traumatic stress disorder would exist at in an individual, but we're talking about it as a collective level.
So are you looking at the relationship, for example, you said zoo animals and us. Are you saying that sort of one is the chicken and one is the egg in the sense of that we are mirroring each other, or is our pattern and our custom of, and we should talk about who we are, Kimosabi, who is the we for one thing, and that's sort of the coda that maybe you can address. And
Sure.
The other is, are they just sort of like chicken and egging back and forth? Is that the notion?
So where I'll do the we in a second. The from a being standpoint, let's look at how, so in captive animals, the colloquialism for this disorder is called zoochosis. More specifically, in animal behavior circles or at zoos, it's characterized by stereotypic behavior, which is this abnormal, repetitive, harmful behavior. So you'll see animals pacing, chewing their own limbs or fur off, pulling their feathers out, throwing up, eating it, throwing up again, banging their heads into walls, different things like this. And one of the main connections to how people have in the past thought this developed was that as beings become a species, right? So for instance, like as we became human, and I'm just going to say like the human race right now, that's the we in this moment. We did it in participation with what wasn't human. So the bodies that we have, the minds that we have, the emotions we have, the neural connections that we're able to have, every being does that by interacting with place, not like the world, but a specific place. And with at least how we've looked at how ethologists, how animal behaviorists have looked at this was separate, like humans are a different thing, but in animals, evolution works like this. We develop these body morphologies that allow beings to interact with the ecosystems and kind of complete the loop. So it's almost like there's an ecosystem with a gap in it, and as an animal completes the loop by developing a body morphology that fits that system, a behavioral set of traits that allow it to interact, interface, and participate with that system. Now, what happens when that animal is taken out of that context? Well, you've got an incomplete system, and you've got a being that's still got this behavioral morphology, this whole set of behaviors and traits that it's trying to interact with. So in zoos, the idea has been that the impulse, the instinct to continue these behaviors still exists, even though the context is different. And that kind of void and inability to perform these behaviors is where this symptom comes from. And as we look at more and more species leaving the planet, we just watch that gap and the ecosystems working together get bigger and bigger, fail and fail.
So just you've used the term, you're talking about ethology, and you refer yourself as a behaviorist, even though now you have a PhD in psychology. And also, and you and I've discussed this before, the term zoochosis. Are you intending to maintain, and you think there's a utility in maintaining a separation linguistically, conceptually, between humans and non-humans?
I think the terms zoochosis, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, tonic immobility, and enculturated captivity can be used synonymously. I think there's a politics involved into which one we would use. So I think zoochosis is problematic because it essentially says this is a disorder of animals. And it reinforces that separation between human animals and non-human animals. So, and to say it's a human zoochosis just feels kind of silly to me.
So
And
why
I
not
think
use the term psychosis or psychological disorder or set of symptoms?
I think in creating the connections across them, I think where I often like to do is offer the different lenses of here's what we understand about zoochosis as its own thing, and then in humans how we have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and then allowing the overlays to exist together. And when I overlay them, the one that I choose is enculturated captivity, because I think it addresses the environmental failures, it addresses the collective issue, it addresses that exists across beings that are in captivity. So when, I suppose, discussing the literature or what has been known up to this point on zoochosis, I think it's an interesting place to start. And I think the term is really provocative, but I don't think it's the best term to actually describe what's going on. I think it does just reinforce that separation, which isn't really the point.
So then you're arguing that it really shouldn't be used, that we should have and then there is sort of movement. I think Mark Bekoff had a recent article, recent is in quotation marks, I don't remember the time frame, but within the last few years, and others have spoken about having a species common language, which would really, and of course, the power of language, is understandable to really harness into that. So I'm sort of zooming in. It sounds like you're contradicting yourself. So should we be using really a common language to talk about these kinds of situations? And zoo in itself, is almost like a subset of something. It's almost like in my mind, it becomes an entity, and it sort of detracts away from what I understood to be your thesis arc, which is this notion of sort of the captive mentality, which has started to permeate and ricochet back and forth in terms of becoming its own being. So I guess in my mind, what you're arguing, maybe I'm misunderstanding that the term of zoochosis really is archaic. It is problematic, and it tends to focus again on not understanding our quote unquote symptoms and problems as relational based, as part of this whole system, the way you describe a system, which I think is a very important point that you made, that it's a system of which these different expressions are emerging and have emerged.
I mean, in my writing, in the dissertation, enculturated captivity is what I land on. And I do say kind of upfront that zoochosis is a misnomer and kind of points us in the wrong direction. I think it's often, I use it as an entry point to allow people to understand what's happening with the captive zoo animals, and then kind of begin to overlay that back onto their own lives. So it could be just like a device that's how I've been able to have success having the conversation, is starting with zoochosis and then kind of popping the bubble that it's actually a misnomer and based in kind of a genetic determinism that kind of sets animals apart from humans almost as automatons of lacking what humans have, which isn't where I'm going at all. And I think you know that. So enculturated captivity is what I land on, and it's what I use for all of it. I think maybe I've just like gotten used to like starting with zoochosis and then leading people. I think maybe I just like to see the pop. I like to see the change from animals, humans, and then watching people walk away at the end with, oh, beings. That just might be the joy that I get is watching that shift happen. Mm-hmm. But it could be problematic to even just say zoochosis anymore. Maybe I should think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because that's what we do see in the literature within scholarship, and science, of course, is the main one, has been in charge of non-humans. And we see this linguistic parsing coming up. So in animal models where they're using rats and cats and dogs and monkeys and you name it as surrogates for humans in experimentation. Obviously, there is that unitary model of brain, mind, and consciousness, right? Which I labeled transspecies psychology, but that's basically science, tacit science. And then in the reportage, say using rhesus monkeys as sort of surrogates for humans to look into schizophrenia and doing all these different kinds of bizarre torture type of experiments. And then the reportage is linguistically parsed. So all of a sudden we're talking about rhesus behavior and the inference for human psychology and psyche. So that's where I think that this is a tricky ground, is that that's such a strong thing. And then when you look in the legal circles, we also have that demarcation of animals as property, as things. And of course, these movements like the nature right movements, as well as the animal rights movements, is really trying to kind of erase those kinds of barriers. How do you, now that you've been working and studying and talking about this enculturated captivity, how are you bringing that in as kind of a lens and an approach to quote unquote solving things?
Well, first I just wanted to say
things, you know what I mean? And
yeah, no, for sure. I can definitely speak to that in a moment. I just want to say, like, I'm totally with you on the two sets of language being problematic, and like culls for non-human animals and genocides for humans, and it kind of just moves us away and creates a separation again. So I'm right there with you. And I think one of the cool things, if anyone engages with the writing that I've done, it bounces, the work that I've done bounces across what some have called Adam's Wall, Calvin Luther Martin's term Adam's Wall, which is that species divide, and it kind of just offers those two sides back and forth and kind of tries to disassemble that wall altogether. So enculturated captivity, in terms of how am I using it to help make things better? I think in ecopsychology, there's been a lot of disparate diagnosis, and it's kind of gotten in the way of doing anything helpful in terms of kind of bringing the human back into the world, bringing the human back into being membership with the rest of the world. And I think having a singular diagnosis was the hope that, in the same way that PTSD as a diagnosis was able to collect across all these different symptoms as veterans returned home from the war, and was able to collect all these different interventions that we're not supporting and turn them into one focused thing that was actually able to benefit people. And in the same way that there's a big push to get complex post-traumatic stress disorder into the DSM, because it accounts for so many of the misdiagnoses of ADHD and ADD and what is the oppositional defiance disorder, things like this. And as it collects together a lot of the different symptoms, complex post-traumatic stress disorder would create a unified approach. And for me, enculturated captivity really speaks to the context, because the hope is, if we understand the context and what it's doing, we can actually make shifts on that context. And the hope is that with that many well-intentioned ecotherapists and ecopsychologists and people working to actually have the human be a healing and enhancing member, someone who could make the world more vital by living with it, not kind of leaving a wake of destruction everywhere, that would be the benefit. Personally, I use it with, I do a lot of like wilderness work and get kids outside and work with people outside and really try to bring them back to their senses. That's one of the things with trauma work and somatic experiencing, that there's really something tied to sensory perception and really engaging the body in connection with that which is not human. That seems to really calibrate the system. And hopefully from a calibrated system, we can make some new decisions as a people.
Mm-hmm. One of the more powerful, I'd say one of them, the most powerful in my mind, aspect of introducing trauma into the biomedical and psychomedical arenas, and also it's just sort of the gestalt of in the popular media, et cetera, and in vernacular, is that it's relational based. So again, this is kind of like the notion of that, yeah, like we use the example of veterans that you brought up. So veterans are now being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and some of weird other distorted politically based diagnoses, et cetera. But there truly seems to be still a failing, and it's still, in a sense, I understand that just like quantum physics, that both quantum physics and PTSD or trauma are innovative, incredible conceptual breakthroughs. They differ from their predecessors in the sense of, as I said, relational based. Yet they are appropriated by the reductionistic view. So in the case of the veterans, the diagnosis is there, but it's always assigned with the veteran. It's the veteran. And what is lacking is the agent of trauma. So there is, in very plain speak, there's sympathy. Of course, it varies, but generally speaking, there's sympathy for individuals who have been sent abroad to fight in wars and come back with these symptoms and dreadful situations, as well as not being supported for their time, et cetera. And yet there is no connection to the senders, I should say. In other words, they would never have had PTSD if people in this country hadn't sent them there. So how do we bring that? The same thing with the reason I brought up quantum mechanics is used all over the world in various, in security, in the military, however, its philosophical, its foundational interpretation and understanding and insights have been ignored, aside from people like David Bowen. So my question to you is how do we start to bring in the agent? What you're talking about is the individual's awakening and awareness. I'm paraphrasing it, you can correct me. But really, our attention needs to be on the agents. How do we engage agency? So in other words, that's sort of one of my complaints with the zoochosis thing, is that the focus is on the animals, and we understand that, yes, it's because of the zoos. But what is not included in these equations, and this is in legal circles, et cetera, are the people who are putting them in there and keeping them in there and benefiting from that. So can you say, like, what are your ideas in terms of how do we expand our gaze to include the agent and the agents of trauma in order to really stop it? Like, I've forgotten who it was, Dante, whatever his name said, you want to stop trauma? Don't cause it.
Yeah, I love that. There's two main things in there that I think I want to address. One is this kind of the context that's creating this, and in, how do I say this? There's a lot of people creating, in one of the attempts to mitigate stereotypic behaviors, so the abnormal repetitive behaviors, that's how I want to call it, for in zoo animals, which is, we could call it the symptoms of trauma, is to develop these enrichment programs, right? These kind of activity-based ecotherapies for zoo animals that are attempts to bring back aspects of the native or ancestral behavioral ecology back in. It's essentially like creating hunting games or foraging games or setting up jungle gyms for the zoo animals, with the attempt at introducing more welfare. And the people that design these things actually come under a lot of pressure from animal rights groups, because they're actually increasing the likelihood that animals will remain in captivity, right? Because there's this utilitarian argument with zoos of, like, the most good for the least amount of harm. So the argument is that zoos are doing research, conservation, breeding programs, education, reintroduction, all these things. And if only a few animals are suffering, then this is great. We should keep zoos. Let's keep zoos. That's the idea. So then by creating therapies that mitigate the suffering inside a cage, we've created the argument to keep animals in cages because they're not suffering now. So that's like one of the great issues of how do we actually address what's going on. And similarly with ecotherapy and what's happening with the human animal is ecotherapy has taken this turn that's attempting to mitigate kind of behavioral symptoms of depression or just not wanting to live this way. Whereas the original ecotherapy question was, is the way we're living making us sick? And instead of, well, maybe we should be living a different way. Maybe people should be living a different way. Maybe society as a whole should be rethinking something. Ecotherapists taking people out on the weekend, they're feeling great, they're outside more, and it's, wow, I can keep doing this job. This is great. I don't feel as bad as I did. It's like, well, that's perfect for that person, unless that person is like a exec working in the tar sands, one of the most ecologically destructive projects on the planet. We've just made that person better at doing their job, which is net kind of negative to the world. So that's one aspect I wanted to just like name about shifting the context. And then the other piece that you'd said about trauma just being kind of misused as this like catch-all term is kind of being reduced and used politically. And I think one of the main shifts in trauma that has happened is this neurophysiological approach to trauma. So not being a mental disorder, but being an injury to the body, something that comes from Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and Ogden and some others, which is looking at the body as actually being injured in trauma. And if you let me set that up real quick, it's in terms of the veteran, like what was actually happening there? Is it, oh, it's the veteran, they couldn't handle it. That was a lot of the old rhetoric when it was called shell shock or all the different names really put it on some sort of character defect in a soldier. And what it really is the current thinking is that when active defense or active escape are both thwarted, all that's left is freeze. And this is consistent across beings. When active escape is available, when something is being hunted or chased down, it escapes. When active defense is available, can take that approach as well. But then tonic immobility is the freeze state that what's left over when active escape or active defense are not available. And there's different thoughts about why tonic mobility is. Tonic mobility you can think of as playing possum, the kind of frozen state. And one of the thoughts is that it just kind of, it's like playing dead, so the being might get a chance to escape if the predator gets bored or thinks it's dead, or actually dissociate it out of its body so that it won't feel the pain of being eaten alive. Now, in the case of any sort of shock trauma, any sort of like war or combat, yeah, there's going to be situations where I think anyone thinking would be like, I don't want to be here on this field with this gun. And yet there's this contrivance, these orders, this hierarchy that demand that someone's there. It creates a double bind that can't be, there's no active defense, there's no active escape. There's just a freeze state in the body. And the inability to get out of that freeze state, that's trauma. It's the injury to that incomplete orienting defense mechanism. And in the case of captivity, there's no escape because it's a cage, right? It's physically a cage. And then as we move more into like the relational base with humans, we have issues of domestic violence or kids growing up in dangerous households, or some school situations set the thing up as well, or enculturated captivity, which is just modern techno-industrial society as the largest cage that creates an inability for active defense and an inability for active escape in a low-grade kind of way. I think I addressed what you're going for, but you let me know.
It was interesting, but no.
Okay.
My you talk, for me, there's still a focus on the individual who is experiencing trauma, and there is very little attention that is spent on the agent of trauma. So, for example, in the discussion, generally speaking, these are all generalizations. In the military, the trauma solutions are and the treatments are not connected to the disabling of a machine. which is a war machine, a military, economic, and psychological and social machine that, I'll speak for the United States, that has been created, which just cranks out traumatized individuals within that context. So in other words, the treatment, in the case of, say, for example, a psychiatrist who's seeing a child or someone who has suffered from or is suffering from domestic violence, right? There is a kind of an effort in the sense of taking away that individual from the source of the stress. In other words, from the abuser. We do not see that in the case of the military. That's not there because there is no abuser, right? It just happens to this person. So that's what I'm trying to say. And I'm saying that which I think you're leading up to, which is perfect because it's the theme of our webinar. And that is with the animals in the same way. In the zoo conditions and the enrichment and the criticism, et cetera, it doesn't matter how many toys they've got. And it has nothing to do with just being confined. It has to do with a completely different worldview and understanding, which is this animal has been basically cut from this continuity of life. And it happens to be in a box. But there's been all of this trauma and assault, which has preceded that. So given that, and what you said earlier, maybe we should be starting to think, this is your sort of your criticism or critique, I'll put it that way, of ecotherapy, is that it's a weekend, eco-warrior type thing. What is your vision? In other words, what is your vision of how we should start to live? What is the goal? What is the image from the work that you've been doing and the work that you are continuing to be doing with children, largely, or large part? What is the vision of how we are to live? What do you see emerging for you in that vision?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think I just wanted to bring it back to the in your speaking about the military. I hear you really wanting like a perpetrator to be named and held accountable in all of this. And I think the one that I can focus on is the context and the contours of the cage. And that's like why I try to outline most of what the context is at the issue. I consider the context, the relationship itself, to be what's wrong, what the perpetrator is. So the zoo in itself, you can't keep animals in cages and expect them to be healthy. They're not built to generate health. So that, just to name that, like, I'm on it, but the perpetrator for me is the context. I want to name that. And what's,
I'm not using the term perpetrator. I'm talking about the mechanism of trauma. And the mechanism of trauma, for in the case that you brought up of veterans, is this system which takes individuals and puts them in this situation, which results in trauma of those individuals. Mm-hmm. And there is very little discussion about the machinery that begins the whole thing, that puts these individuals into those kinds of situations. So in other words, when you're looking at in any kind of situation, whether it doesn't matter whether you're a veterinarian or whatever, you've got somebody who's hurting or wounded or whatever, you do look at the context. In trauma, you look at what the context is, you look at what the agent of trauma is. That's the foundational thing in the DSM, because it's not just an intrapsychic phenomena. It brought attention to the fact that it's an interpsychic expression or experience. Something on the outside did something on the inside here. Okay, so it's a relational thing. So we're talking about a system. So you're calling it context, and I'm not looking for a perpetrator. Like I said, this is very important because we're at a point right now where we're having to revisualize a completely different sort of architecture and worldview of what the future will be, how we are to live on this planet. That's what I want you to get at. So I'm not looking for a perpetrator. There's too damn many perpetrators. I'm a perpetrator.
Sure.
I'm on this side of the fence. I haven't been in Vietnam. Okay.
Got it. Yeah, and I'm just naming that the way that I feel like I stepped on a landmine there, pardon the pun, and And I just wanted to bring it back to like the zoo is the system, that the captivity is the system, the cultural captivity of us is the system that I'm looking at. But how to live on the world, I mean, that's a huge question, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think this is it may not be that huge. In other words, we're here and we have a goal that the image that I use to kind of bring it down into something manageable is saying, let's say you go out and hike, right? And you decided you want to go over to this place and go camping, right? Well, you got your topo map and you've got this thing and you kind of make a little path out. You say, well, we're going to do this. Well, then you go over the first mountain, you kind of go, oh, wow, it looks really different. So I'm changing my route when I'm, to get to that quote unquote final destination. So, the purpose of this webinar was to start to get people to visualize, where are we going? We know what's wrong. Yes, you can argue about some of the details of it, but where are we headed? How would you like to see this children? I mean, not that you're God, but, what are the kinds of ways in which you see these individuals living and coming out of this enculturated captivity? How are they going to live every day? We understand how we live every day, whatever job you've got, whatever refrigerator, but how does that, what we know is wrong, how does that translate in a very concrete idea of taking what you have studied and applying it to a new future?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I love that. The when I look at enculturated captivity and kind of unifying the last 30 years of ecopsychology as looking at that, it's the way we are living is making us sick, and there has to be some changes there. Now, when I think about in the same context as it is the zoos, and there is that it is the zoos that are having the impact on animals in zoos. So in a reintroduction model, it would be like, great, let's teach the different animals in the zoos how to live back in the world and reintroduce them back to the wild. Most of them, there isn't much of a wild left to return to. And for us, this is where I think we see a lot of the rewilding folks and a lot of the turns towards going back to the land. And my kind of worry around interventions towards that, as much as I think they're super cool and I think there's a lot to get out of that kind of wilderness skilling, is I don't know any of my indigenous friends or native folks who are saying, let's go be hunter-gatherers. That's like white people saying that. So I'm super suspect of that. And the more I look at like what has actually
there are white people who are saying things like that. It's not purely indigenous. There's white people who are saying that.
No, I'm saying it's only white people. Like okay. It's only like I don't know anybody indigenous who's saying let's go live in teepees. It's white people saying it. It's like a fallacy. It's not a. To me, it's actually like more of a trauma response. It's using a past survival story.
There are indigenous people who are basically saying that. The Andaman Islands, for example, there's an organization called Survival International, and they support, quote unquote, indigenous people. They have a definition for what that means in terms of their right to live the way they want. And the Andaman people do not want anyone coming to their islands. We have the tribes in the Amazon that are basically being murdered. They are, quote unquote, living on the land, obviously in diverse ways, but they are living, quote unquote, on the land or on the water in that way. So there are humans on the planet that are strongly supporting the idea. I'm not sure that they're in the mode or whatever of dictating, but they certainly have been very active in urging people on the outside to stop doing what they're doing and to consider adopting ways the way they do.
Right. So I want to talk about the ways of finding the ways. I think what I'm trying to say is we have like an abstracted, homogeneous way of living on the world right now. It's this agrarian-based culture that just like spreads all over the place at this point. And what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a way of garnering information from the land, listening first, that allows us to interact with different places in the way that will make them most vital. I think about what you called the outside as a hopscotch mentality. And then I think of this other way that I'm kind of pointing to as double Dutch. So, the two games. So
No. Oh, I
know
know
hopscotch?
hopscotch. I know
Okay.
hopscotch.
Double Dutch is the two skipping ropes going back and forth, right?
Okay.
So just let me give you this. So two groups happen upon this like forested hillside, right? One of them wants to live the way we do. So they see it and they go, okay, cool. I know what to do with this. I'm going to level the trees. I'm going to flatten. I'm going to level the trees. I'm going to flatten the land. I'm going to pave it. I'm going to paint some human symbols on it, and then just participate with these human symbols. That's hopscotch, right? That's how modern techno-industrial society rolls when it finds new land.
Mm-hmm.
Now, double Dutch, on the other hand, is I come to this space, I watch it, I listen to it, I find out what's already working. What are the existent relationships here? What's already working, right? How do I find the flow? How do I find what's already working here and insert myself in it in a way to make it more vital, right? So that, I think, is the method. That is the method. And Michael Cohen has got some great ecotherapies that point towards how to do that at an individual level. David Abram has some great writings to bring it more into a sensual, sensory place with that. And traditional ecological knowledge really speaks to how to develop a lifestyle practice, how to develop culture that emerges from the land, not from an abstract place that I brought from somewhere else to put on top of this land and just paint my hopscotch across the world, but how to actually listen, use my senses in the here and now and take direct action. And that's why I keep coming back to this kind of idea of a cultural trauma, because the main symptoms of trauma from somatic experiencing are a loss of an ability to fully attune sensorially and an inability to take direct action in the here and now. And those are two things that you need to play double Dutch, and those are two things that we need to do to live in the world. So how do we develop those things? What are the activities, interventions, ways you can live your life that allow us to engage our senses, kind of allow us to, I would say, become human again by using our senses to find out how the land, whatever land we happen to be on, because it's going to be different for every place, how does it want us to live? So I think that's a great place to start. And what are the activities? What are the games? What are the educations? What are the ecotherapies that we can do with people that allow them to enjoy and also experience their bodies as it experiences the world from a bottom up, not a top down? Double Dutch over hopscotch.
That's great. Well, we kind of reached the witching hour, and I have, of course, Jillian, more questions, but I'll exercise a democracy and open it up for Liz to have other people ask questions. Thanks.
Well, it's always fun. I'm never sure where we're going to end up. It's always fun to talk to you. So thanks for doing it with me.
Well, you ended up with a PhD, right?
Yeah.
So we agreed on something.
Yeah, we agreed on something.
Thank you both. It's been a very interesting and enlivened interview. We already have some activity in the chat box, so that just goes to show that some folks' wheels are already turning. Before we get to opening it up to Q&A, I just want to do a couple quick plugs. If you are interested in learning more about enculturated captivity and how that relates to ideas like zoochosis, Vaughan will be teaching a class with the Carruthers Institute, Carruthers Learning Institute, I should say, in the next month or so. So keep an eye out for that. That's going to be really exciting. And if you want to learn more, you can also visit his website, which is vaughanwilkins.com, or his Instagram at Vaughan Wilkins. I'll put those in the chat box now. Don't leave though. You have to look at them after we get done. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free you can unmute yourself, you can kind of raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable with it being read out loud, then I can do that if you just want to put it in the chat box. Did anyone have anything out the gate?
I'll jump in. I feel like I have a lot out of the gate. That was a wonderful discussion, Vaughan and Gay. I think I'm going to try and trace back from where we just were with your discussion on hopscotch versus double Dutch. And that seemed to correspond with the question I had around how humans are to move forward in our relationship with other animals. And it seems that that double Dutch method is almost a way of like us pulling back a bit, actually a lot, a lot, and reorganizing ourselves, not from kind of that anthropocentric, how do we make our place here, but really how do we pull back how much we've made our place here in order to properly reintegrate ourselves with the ecosystems where we find ourselves here on the planet. And so I guess that wasn't really a question, but it seems that that is what you're pointing to in order to answer the question, how should we be living at this point? And I guess my question around that is the fact that we've barricaded ourselves from those ecosystems. Does ecopsychology see that as kind of our own form of psychosis, kind of our own human version of what's happening to the animals in the zoos that are now in buildings now? I live near a cemetery and I walk through it and I think, wow, even in death, we barricade ourselves from the natural environment. So is the way that we have kind of walled ourselves off, especially over the last number of 100 years, is that seen as incredibly problematic in how we are to move forward to be better participants in the Earth's ecosystem? Is that a question?
Yeah, no, I could find it in there. No,
Okay.
I'm right there with you. Yeah, no. So ecopsychology started out as a reframe on psychology, kind of looking at what we consider to be a normative, what is considered by traditional, I'm weeing up the space today, I get it, but like what traditional psychology would consider to be normal, healthy baseline of health. Well, that normal, healthy baseline of health is leading to mass species extinction and the death of the living world. So can we actually consider that health? And that's where ecopsychology started the conversation of like, what does health look like if you actually open us up to being human? Because I don't know that you can actually be human without an ecology. Like the human inside a vacuum, I don't know that that's a human anymore. I don't know what it is, but in the same way that if you had an elephant chained in a pen and it no longer was elephant, like engaged in the activity of elephant, engaged in the relationships of elephant, was just chained there, lying there, it is now a sack of genetic material, right? It is not it's relationships, it's being anymore. So I don't know how to be a human without relationships. So ecopsychology, I think, started with that ecology meets psychology, but ecos, right, in Greek is home. So it's actually the psychology of homecoming. And I think that is a great place of like what our senses and what it is to like re-inherit our carnal presence in this planet and in place and with the others is what it would be like to come home and actually belong again, not on our terms, but on what was already here. How are we invited into being in relationship?
That's beautiful. Thank you. And not to take up too much time, but I do want to kind of trace it back to my original question for you, which was kind of what Gay was pointing to around zoochosis. It just seems that like the rhetoric around zoochosis is problematic because it doesn't include that the fact that animals shouldn't be in these captivity situations to begin with. And like, does much of the discourse around zoochosis include that aspect that, like, as Gay has said and other things, that like this is just something that's not meant to be. It's especially not meant to be, knowing what we know now. So is that included, or is it just framed from this like these animals should not be behaving this way, even though they're in these very awful situations?
Yeah, I think you're right on it there. So like zoochosis is largely used colloquially by zookeepers and the internet and now me. And stereotypic behaviors and abnormal repetitive behaviors is what the scientific literature is often really speaking about. And like the lineage of zoos was like they were crown jewel collections for royalty. Then they were menageries, kind of like plants in a greenhouse. And then the first zoo in London was a research facility that was built to understand animals. So no part of its existence was built to generate health, wellness, conservation, any of it. There is a bunch of really great publicity, I guess is the word, for why zoos exist. But a lot of the research is from a welfare standpoint. So not whether animals should live or die, but what is the manner of that life or death? And that's where this question of how to mitigate the suffering, because it came from a welfare standpoint. That's where a lot of this emerged from, was what are the 5 freedoms? And if we have to keep animals in captivity, but wait, why did the conversation start there with we
right,
have to
like
keep animals in
why
captivity?
we don't exactly.
Right. So that's I think where it came from. So I think you're right on it, pointing to like why are we even doing this? My kind of visions for zoos is I really hope to be gifted, or at least like sold for a couple dollars, the National Zoo and the San Diego Zoo, because I think healing facilities actually is the future of zoos. Like what it is to take beings and bring them back to health. And I don't have all the answers to that, but I do know that the purpose of them now is as entertainment facilities is doing a lot more harm than anything. But like they don't have to be there in the first place. We're at a point where I think a lot would argue that there isn't much of a wild left anymore. So I think that's the only thing I'd point to is I'm not sure that people are really looking forward to having large carnivores reintroduced. Where I live in Oakland, I don't know that people are ready for lions walking down the streets. Like,
well, they don't belong in Oakland. I mean, like they would be going back to.
I get you. I'm just like a lot of the rewilding aspects of like how when we brought when the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, and like what a great story that was. Can that reintroduction happen on a larger scale? Is there a place? Is there a Yellowstone for every animal? And I don't know that I have the answer to that.
I don't want to interrupt, but I will.
No, jump in here. This is your show.
I think there's plenty of wild.
Yeah.
And I think we have to understand that. I think Oakland is plenty of wild as well. It just needs to dig up the pavement and people to start acting like there were cougars always around and there were coyotes all around, and learn to adapt until the earth can take back the pavement and the buildings and things. So in my mind, there's plenty of wild. It has to do with humans learning how to help the animals navigate into getting food. I mean, obviously you can't go to what was it called, the Renaissance Cafe, which my favorite coffee place in Berkeley. A cougar can't get a burger there, right? So that there are those kinds of things, but I think there's plenty of wilderness, and I think that there's a strong movement within the highbrow scientific circles that was basically, you guys have heard about, I think E.O. Wilson was part of it, about saying, hell with the rest of it, we're going to take this one chunk and save it for the animals. Crazy. Okay. And then also in terms of prioritizing, understanding most of the planet is gone. To me, that is completely contrary to anything. So I'll stop. Well, I know Corey has something to say, but I mean, in that mind, I think there is plenty of wild, and we can facilitate it, and we can increase the quote unquote wild.
I'll just say real quick that the wild is a construct. It's a human made up thing. So the way humans see it is what determines whether it exists or not, because of who's running the planet right now. So I think this kind of actually engaging people in the coming back home, like finding what it is to be alive on a planet and wanting that and fighting for it, I think would say a lot. But I was hanging out with some hunters, some duck hunters, and just to find out how much money like hunters are spending for conservation efforts, it's like there's a lot of places that would have been developed without that money. So I think wild being a construct, enrolling more people and wanting to bring more wild, or just think differently of what is wild and where we all belong, would do the work. I do think you're going to have a tough time without that construct change, without that mental change in the way people think about it. That's it.
I do see that Christine has her hand up. Is it related to this particular conversation, Christine?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll let you go ahead before we open up a different question since we're already on this thread.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
misunderstood you. This is
No,
like
you're
a
fine.
different question on a different thread.
Okay.
Well, I just want to say, as an ashamed former zookeeper, I understand exactly what's being talked about with the term zoochosis. And I was wondering if I could ask Vaughan, does he think, it's kind of a weird question, but is the fact that humans as an animal themselves even have created the idea and existence of zoos, is that actually showing some sort of zoochosis on our part, based on the fact that we would do something like that, that's put animals in captivity? Is that a sign of our larger cultural, I forget the exact words you use, but yeah.
I think you could definitely, I don't know that there are other animals that take captives. So I would say that there's a lot of things that humans do. And I think you're right on it in like interrogating the different behaviors that pass as normal. And this year, especially looking at different groups of people and who's creating hierarchies and behaviors and imposing different rules and regulations and restrictions on even different people. And then we see us doing that, seeing humans do that to animals in all sorts of different ways. I think you're right on it in terms of anyone creating that kind of a hierarchy, that kind of a separation. What kind of a striving is that? A striving to not be something, a striving to separate, a striving to have power over. Is it a security thing? Is it a comfort thing? And we've seen that a lot this year in the news in a lot of ways. So I think you're right on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question, Christine. Thank you. Corey, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? You need to unmute. Yeah.
There you go. I don't know if it's it's a question for Vaughan. First of all, Vaughan, very, very interesting. Thank you. Do you think moving forward, this is sort of a natural progression of our species? So I want to clarify what I mean. We talk about sort of this overall trauma, this feeling of helplessness, which comes from feeling separate from things. So if we're separate, we have to control things. If we can't control it, then we feel helpless, and that leads to the trauma. But just like as a human grows up, a baby and an adolescent, they sort of feel connected. And only when they get into adolescence do they start to feel more independent and want to show their independence by controlling things, playing the loud music, we all did it, and having this. But then the next progression, as our brain grows even more, we get reintegrated into things. And so do you think what's going on now, and what I mean by now is now several hundred years even in the past, and maybe in the future as well, is this disorder of sort of becoming more independent and the control, and this where we have the animals in zoos and controlling the environment and doing what we think is best for them, seeing ourselves as separate beings put into this world to sort of take care of it rather than being integrated and a part of it. But as people grow and their brains develop, maybe our culture and society will grow and develop to become more integrated later on. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that question. That's great. Thanks, Corey. The individuation process, I think, is like kind of what we're talking about here, of how to when kids grow up and individuate away from their parents and become their own selves. And Bill Plotkin's got a great book on the topic as a cultural people. Is that what we're doing right now? Called Nature and the Human Soul. And it's about this kind of, that are we stuck in an adolescent period that we're unable to move forward from, or if we're just in this prolonged adolescence where we are just playing our music or like breaking things for the fun of it, or just to like find out who we are. And I'd say the only part that I feel like some like concern or reticence around is kind of like projecting that humans felt themselves to be like I think that would work if I am the earth and I can't distinguish myself from the earth. Okay, now I'm separate from the earth. And then there's this third synthesis that comes in where it's like I am here and maybe there's a stewardship model. So I think the one part that I feel like concern or uncertainty around is that a fair projection to say that humans in the past felt that like they were just the earth and could not be separate from it? Or is that maybe like an oversimplification? But I think that there's been a lot of thinking about this, and I super invite you to check out Bill's book. That's a cool one.
Yeah, we'd like to. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
Thanks, Corey. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one comes from Molly and Armando, and they say, thank you so much. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you work with humans and if/how you work with non-human animal recovery. And feel free, Molly or Armando, to add to that if I'm missing anything.
Yeah, so currently, I worked with dogs for a number of years after. So I was doing zoo research. We didn't do my path at all, but I was doing, started studying African wild dogs in captivity because I was trying to figure out how beings could actually work together. And they're the most obligate social mammals that I want to interact with. They're these dogs that have to work together to get food, have to work together to breed. And when I saw them in captivity, they wouldn't do any of the things they were supposed to do. And I started trying to figure that out. But I took what I learned about enrichment and trying to give beings back their behavioral ecology, give them back the life that their bodies were actually designed to participate with. And I moved out to the Bay and started working with dogs. And that's kind of how I built it. Was I would work with people who had adopted rescue dogs who had experienced a bunch of trauma and were having a bunch of behavioral issues, and actually just reinserted them back into a pack style life where they were interacting with other dogs and they were going through different ecosystems during the day. I would set up kind of different scents and teach them to kind of track them through the woods. We had a lot of different games that were set up around this idea of enrichment, or what would it be like to give a being back the life that it was built to live. And we could say that their captivity was the house, and the family is wondering why they're eating the couch. And it's like, oh, it's stereotyping. They're eating the couch because they have this other way that they want to live. Why don't we just go give them that? So I spent most of my days doing that until I got really curious as to whether it would work with people. So I started working with the littles, with little kids, and doing wilderness skills and outdoor education, and trying to fill their day with real human stuff. Like, what would it be like to spend the day immersed under the sky, hearing the birds, and kind of, once again, if we became human in interaction with that which was not human and not made by humans, the answer just might be in fully allowing our senses to feel that. And that brought me kind of just up through the age groups and working with high school students and teaching wilderness skills and outdoor education to the high school students. I kind of found, I remembered that humans are also nature, right? So sensually engaging with nature is also human to human, and realize that a lot of what happens in what is super important in high school is building these relationships. And I was watching so many people enter rooms and trying to learn in spaces of fear and spaces they didn't feel safe. So I decided, instead of teaching content, what if I just taught engagement, belonging, and joy? And what if kids entered that room every day and they knew when they woke up they were going to spend their day immersed in engagement, belonging, and joy? What would they learn then? And that's where I think I found something sweet that I haven't fully understood yet, but I'm running a college prep kind of program right now that tries to engage kids, not just in funneling them into a system and into a college pathway for them, but what is it to fully explore what works for you, and like what is wellness, and how do we actually have these real conversations in a space of love, joy, and belonging say it worked a lot better in person. The virtual school is a different beast this year on the computer. But I think there's something really special in the human to human interaction between trying to spend most of our days in belonging, engagement, and joy.
Thanks, Vaughan. I think even as
Thank you so
adults,
much. Really,
Yeah.
really, thank you.
yeah, I think even as adults, we could use more of that in our day-to-day for sure. So we do have another question in the chat from Melody. She says, I heard that there is a fourth response recognized besides fight, flight, or freeze, and I believe it's known as friending.
Cool. I think calling it friending is great. It's definitely a social affiliative relationship one. I think that, so for what I understand about the polyvagal theory, we have this nerve here called the vagus nerve. So the polyvagal theory is essentially there's three brains. So the freeze response is our oldest. It comes from when we were all fish and all we could do was freeze. Then we had fight and flight. And so the one that we revert to, the one you go to most kind of shows like which part of your brain is working. Are you a fighter, a flighter, or are you a freezer? I'm a freezer, so I'm full fish mode when I get super triggered, right? But the friending is the one we're reaching for. It's the social affiliative one. It's the one it's checking in with someone. It's just like looking over there, like, okay, they look like they're okay. Are they safe? Okay, they seem safe. Am I safe? And this is where the attachment relationship between child and caregiver comes in, and the attachment relationship just between friends as we grow up, and lovers and romantic partners of, am I okay? Okay, well, you're okay. You're okay, I'm okay. And being able to check in with each other, that community one is I think the one to reach for in terms of the height of evolution, or at least the development. And I don't know, one that feels the best as well. Freezing sucks, and like fighting and flighting don't feel much better. But friending, that's a great one. So I think you're right on it. Just like bring it back to the kids in school. It's like that's, I think, really like what we're going for is to, when we put them in like high intensity situations, or they have to build a shelter, or they're given a knife and a log and they have to figure out how to split it down and cook their own food for the day. It's like, cool, how do we work together, and how do we solve this out? How do we handle the challenges? And I think if we have those as people, if we had them as parents, amazing. If we didn't, then we work towards building them. Earned secure attachment is when we earn secure attachment later in life. And I think that one really ties in well to this friending strategy.
Christine, did you have another question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, I wasn't unmuted.
No problem.
I was just wondering if Vaughan can recommend anything besides ecotherapy to help with a person like myself who's feeling this day-to-day sort of dysfunction, not having a nature conscious society. Besides ecotherapy, is there anything else you can recommend for help with coping with that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think ecotherapy is super broad, right? So I would say, if finding safe ways to engage your body and your senses that are not an interaction with human-made things. There's this idea that there's this just like connection, like that we've got this symbolic connection to our senses are. I'll say that Michael Cohen has this great book called Reconnecting with Nature. It's kind of a different kind of ecotherapy. You wouldn't have to go to a therapist. This is just something that like is a really fun self-exploration, but it's really valuable for how to engage your senses with place and begin this listening to place. So I would say that if you're looking for something you can do, it's a really easy read that's just kind of feels lo-fi, low pressure. That would be a great start. But it's the idea that our senses are often asking us to recalibrate in something that is not human. So when we're outside and we're just like standing in a park, it's like, what do we feel attracted to in this moment? Is it to go stand in the sun? Is it to go touch that tree? Is it to go pet that dog? And just allowing that part of our body, the non-rational mind, not the abstract thinking mind, but just the sensory wanting mind. If we can follow those attractions, can we recalibrate our bodies to the living world, to the natural world? I think that's one of my favorite places to start. And when I kind of get confused or forget, like, how do I do this human thing again? That I start with the senses and try to find a place where I can do that. Doing it inside, though, you end up rebonding to human-made things, and that's kind of the cage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hope that's helpful, Christine. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's definitely, any ideas are helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have Sandra asking also, how about art, painting, movement, music? And I would add, mindfulness practice as well.
I think they're going to be, all the gateways are a little different. One of my favorite is movement, for sure. Definitely movement. Meditation, absolutely. I think that there's a definite connection between, conditioning the ego and captivity. When traumatogenic or problematic norms are put onto us, that's the conditioning process. The conditioning process exists within the ego. Meditation is the place of engaging the ego and stepping outside of it, disidentifying. Then for sure, yeah, any freedom from that part of the brain, which I think is like where the sensing comes in. So if you can find your flow state in art, painting, release, where you're not caught up in your thoughts, I think that's often when I say the here and now, it's that we're in the present moment, right? Where for many people, it's like the past is like this long thing. You can count it because it's how old you were, right? But the present, well, it's gone now, and now it's gone again, and now it's gone again, and the future is this huge thing. If we're able to open up this present moment to not just be a fleeting, gone thing, that's the place. That's the place where ego isn't. That's the place where the captivity seems to not be able to get to. So I totally dig these other things. I love music.
Thanks, Vaughan. Did anyone have any other questions? I had one question for you, which has to do with, one of the sort of morally ambiguous areas when it comes to captivity that I came across in my own research on parrots and other birds. So often, there's this sort of argument that, without certain captivity situations, there are genomes and animals that would go extinct, and that we have to have, basically say if there's only, 5 Spix's macaws left in the wild, that it would be the most moral thing to capture them, to breed them in captivity, and then to reintroduce them so that there could be some reestablishment of wild populations. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that in terms of, is captivity ever acceptable? And, if so, under these sort of extreme situations, how could it be approached in the way that is, the most mindful to the cultural needs of the animals who are in captivity?
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. So mink, I think, are the first one to come up, that mink wouldn't exist anymore unless they were factory farmed for their fur. And is that morally right or wrong? And I think this is where, like, why when I still talk about or still identify myself as animal behaviorist, it's because of the welfare aspect. Because, and I think it means different things to Gay and I. So I think we're gonna have to have a conversation about that, because maybe I should be taking it off my business cards. But I do welfare. I don't do rights. I don't know who should live and die. I think that one dude ate an apple once and was like, "Oh, I know who should live and die, and I'm gonna run everything." And that was a story from a long time ago, and I didn't eat that apple, and I don't know who should live and die, and I don't understand rights. So when I think about this, I think about what is the manner of a life and the manner of a death. So if captivity is suffering, then no one should be in it. But should something live or die is not a question I'm willing to answer. There's this scene from these like the Planet Earth movies where it's like the wolf chasing down the baby deer, And like for me, at least, I'm at once like, oh, I hope the baby deer gets away. But then I'm like, wait, I really like wolves. Maybe she's got puppies. Oh, I want her to like get the baby deer so she can feed the puppies. And I get stuck in this. Why do I think I should get to decide the ending of that scene? That is not my thing. I should never get to decide that, especially because I'm standing in a privileged space of not being willing to be either of those characters in that scene. I'm not willing to get chased down for my food, and I generally don't chase food down for myself. So I think until any of us are willing to be one of the characters in that scene, got no right to decide who should live and die. So for your question, I think that captivity is dangerous and damaging and does what it does. I would say that I'm opposed to captivity as I stick to welfare. If I was to move into rights, I would get super confused in the morals for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely not clear, in terms of what would be, the right answer. So maybe there isn't one, Thank you. Did
Thanks,
anyone
Liz.
else have any other questions?
I just wanted to say thanks to Vaughan. I know I kind of stepped away from the conversation pretty quickly, but I had a comment about your question, Liz. What would it be like that we repair what we've broken, along the way? Like if those animals who were going extinct it's hard to even tell what's going extinct because of us or not because of us. But I guess I wonder if we would only help those animals by, helping them reproduce if those are animals that we've directly caused them to be endangered. I don't know. That is a tricky moral ground. That's all. It was just my thoughts on that because it's just it's such an interesting question that you posed.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing and adding to it. I mean, for me, I've seen and volunteered in certain, rescue sanctuary situations where their goal was to do reintroduction, not just, sanctuary till death or whatever that may be. And it definitely wasn't, clear, in some ways they were helping, some ways they were hurting. So there was definitely this ambiguity there.
Yeah.
Christine has a comment on that from the.
Yep. Go ahead, Christine.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, sorry, I'm not sure how long we're supposed to go with this, but as a former zookeeper, the zoo I worked at was part of what's called the International Survival Plan, which is for saving endangered species around the world and coordinating different zoos together, which I'm sure I guess you already know about. But I found when I was working at the zoo that these animals are looked upon as nothing more than an egg bank or sperm bank. They're not considered as individual animals that they are. So I think the example, like with the 5 birds left in the wild, although it would be horrible to see that population die off, it also doesn't look like we're going to have any place soon to reintroduce them to the wild, and to take those few and let them suffer through life in captivity due to our mistakes in the first place. And the reason there's only 5 of them left, to me, is really arrogant on our part, and we've already done enough damage. But I just think that I just wanted to put in a thought about that it's better to me. I would rather see them species go extinct peacefully than take them out of their natural environment. And so that was just a comment I had. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Well, it's been terrific. Vaughan has really cross-cut this conversation, has really been beneficial because it also shows that there's a lot of cross-cutting of, traditional walls disciplinarily and topics and linguistically and things like that. And I think that's really important because you get just a lot more flow, in reconsidering ideas and assumptions. And that's a really important contribution. So thank you, Vaughan, and also thank you
Yes.
all for bringing all these different. Was there a hand?
Oh, it was a wave. No, yes, thank you, Vaughan. We really appreciate you sharing, and it's been, I think really fruitful conversation as well for the rest of us. So thanks for sticking around for Q&A, and thank you to all of you for spending part of your weekend with us. We do know, your time is precious, and so we do appreciate you spending some of it with us. We will have our next Living One webinar next Sunday, June 6th. So hopefully we'll see you there. And like I said, if you're interested in more of Vaughan's work, you can visit his website or his Instagram, and he'll have a course that he's teaching through Karulos coming soon. So we hope we'll see some of you there as well.
And that'll be on the webpage too, on the course webpage.
Yes. So thank you all. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.